Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. A couple of days ago I was chatting with a young man that I know that lives in one of the very affluent beachside suburbs of Sydney. And we were talking just about general things, what he was catching up with and so forth. He works as a real estate agent, and he was saying that a lot of his friends who are in their early 20s, like he is, are depressed, really depressed about life. And unfortunately, a lot of them are turning to drugs to feel better. And he said that, this one of the issues that the people have, of course, is that they don't have a faith. And he was saying that he has actually started reading the Bible through, and he's about 20% of the way through. And on the weekends, he sometimes spends several hours reading the Bible. Of course, he's got this plan to read through the Bible. And he's very positive. He says, the way I look on life is, I'm very positive and has a faith. And we got to one of the reasons we got talking about this was we were talking about creation, and he was saying how he has just recently watched a YouTube video on Genesis as history, and he was finding it very interesting. And I swapped story and said, well, I've just watched a very interesting program on the internet as well, a new movie that has been released on the evidence that, again, the theory of evolution just doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. And it was called Dismantled. This particular movie that I was talking to him about was called Dismantled. And the subheading is a scientific deconstruction of the theory of evolution. And I was quite impressed with this. I watched it with several other friends at the time, and they also found the movie quite informative. So again, it's something any of the listeners that are interested, the movie, I think it's going to be available as a DVD, is called Dismantled: A Scientific Deconstruction of the Theory of Evolution. And there's also a website, apparently, www.dismantledevolution, or one word, dismantledevolution.com. And some of the presenters in this DVD were, quite highly qualified. One of the speakers was Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, spelled Jeanson, and apparently he has written a new book called Replacing Darwin: The New Origin of Species. And it sounds very interesting because this particular scientist earned his PhD in cell development and biology from Harvard University. One of the other presenters on the program was Dr. Georgia Pardom, and she also is highly qualified with a PhD in molecular genetics at Ohio State University. And so they're presenting in this movie that we watched, as I said, Dismantled: A Scientific Deconstruction of the Theory of Evolution. And one of the main points that they brought out was that we often think of science versus faith, right? And so you've got religion, and religion is in one box, and that's all about faith and this sort of thing. And science is about facts. That's all in a separate box, and they can't be connected. But what we're talking about is that when we're talking about what the Bible talks about, the Bible is a written account of the history of the world. And the early part was revealed by God, obviously, to Moses, who wrote it down. And God revealed that to Moses. And then as we go further along through the Bible, we have different authors write of their experiences with God, their answers to prayer, their experiences with angels, their experiences with God talking to them, God giving them visions, God giving them prophecies, predicting and warnings, and so forth for the people. And, of course, other accounts are just accounts of history, a record of what happened, the particular kings, what they did, and so forth. And so it's written there as a history for us, and we know that as we read through the Bible, particularly the prophecies, that these prophecies were fulfilled, particularly the ones that weren't conditional, or the ones that aren't still future, like the second coming of Jesus. And as I was talking to this young man that I've known for many years, I said one of the things that I did when I started reading the Bible was, as I came to some of these prophecies in history, I looked them up. I went to the encyclopedias and looked them up and read about them. And so, that was something just to check. And, of course, I found the Bible was history. The Bible's history is real. It's a real account of history. Now, when we look at science, and particularly science, when we look at the science that we have today that does the experiments that have led to, our mobile phones, space travel, cars, advanced medical technology and machines, CAT scanners and so forth. We have, this is everyday reproducible science. But when we're talking about the origins, the science of origins, which the theory of evolution is, so the theory of evolution was a theory that was put up by Darwin and developed by others along the way, that attempted to explain how we came to be here. And essentially it was trying to explain how we came to be here without God being in the picture. In other words, it was a mechanical view of how we came to be here. And we need to remember that Darwin lived in this time when the mechanical worldview was dominating education schools at that particular time. And we saw, as scientists had read Newton's Principle of Mechanics, and which he talked about and delineated the laws of mechanics, many of the laws of physics and so forth. And as physicists discovered these laws and found that they worked by logical mathematical relationships, and using this they were able to, build and develop machines. They were able to harness the power of thermal energy via steam engines and so forth. And so we had this mechanical view of the world and of space as people, applied the mathematical laws to the solar system and so forth. And this gave, the theory of evolution, of course, gave biologists a mechanical model to sort of bring them up, similar to the physics and chemistry and engineering type models that were being developed at the time in this mechanical worldview. And so it was a theory that was put forth, and some of the basis of this theory, of course, was that again we had some philosophers and lawyers like Hutton and Lyell, who had Lyell had ascribed to Hutton's ideas that the Earth was very old, was millions of years old, and this was their assumption, that the Earth was much older than the Bible timeline. They weren't happy with that. But again, it was an assumption, right? An assumption that they made. They looked at some erosion rates and this sort of thing, deposition rates of sediments in river mouths and this sort of thing. And they came to this conclusion. Now, when we have to apply this science in the past, we're trying to use science to understand history. And we know that there are lots of major problems with that. And one of the main reasons is that modern science depends on making observations that are then testable and falsifiable. In other words, we can do experiments to check whether those results are really true or not. And so that's why, scientists put up a theory and then they test whether that theory can work. We try for some other, situations. Well, how can we, falsify the theory and prove that it's wrong? And if we can't and all the results are confirming the original hypothesis, then, it gets largely accepted as science. And especially if we can reproduce it in the results in different laboratories around the world. And it's sort of like measuring the acceleration due to gravity. You can, do that in your classroom sort of thing, and people have done it around the world. We get the same essential answer for measuring the acceleration due to gravity at the surface of the Earth, sea level. So this is what science is about, and this is the type of science, as I said, that has led to the development of the modern technology that we enjoy today. But when we're looking at historical areas, we've got to try and put the picture together from the observations that we have. And as this movie pointed out, how you then interpret the observations depends very much on your worldview. If you look at the Grand Canyon, and one of the examples I use is the Grand Canyon, and they say, and you believe that the Grand Canyon is, 600 million years old, then you're going to attempt to explain all these formations in the Grand Canyon over a time period of 600 million years. If we believe in the Bible account, remember the Bible account is written by Moses and who received this from God, and we have all this evidence down through history of people, many witnesses reporting experience with angels, reporting prophecies which came true, which were fulfilled in detail. And we got like the prophecies of Daniel that span over 1,000 years and were, fulfilled, and hundreds of years to the birth of Christ and so forth, and were precisely fulfilled over long time periods, and we know from the day they were written, when they were written, sort of thing. People tried to ascribe them to later dates, but with the discovery of early scrolls and all this sort of thing, we know they were written. Now we have, very conclusive evidence they were written much earlier, and particularly the ones that were fulfilled way after the time of Christ. And so we have all this data, all this experience. We have all the books written by Christians of experiences of answers to prayer, God talking to them, experiences of angels and so forth. So we've got this overwhelming evidence, empirical evidence of experience, this experiential, empirical evidence for the existence of God. And we have this account of the history of the world. And again, we have that the Grand Canyon would have formed only thousands of years ago after the flood, or about the time of the flood, the global flood on Earth. And so we have this, when we're interpreting historical science, the same evidence, it's the same rock layers out there, but scientists are interpreting it different ways. Now, what they're saying in this, pointing out in this movie is, when we have a look at the actual evidence that we can measure today and actually do measurements today, the biblical account fits the data most accurately. All right, and so a classic example is that, okay, if the Grand Canyon is, 600 million years old, the bottom part of it, and all these layers go up, over span, hundreds of millions of years, how come all the layers are flat and not showing signs of erosion? Well, not all the layers, but, most of the layers you can see are laid down conformably over the top of one another without signs of erosion, yet they're supposed to be laid down over millions of years when you have massive erosion. I mean, a couple of the 12 apostles have eroded away, in the last, 20 or 30 years on the coast of Australia. So we, again, we've got this major inconsistency there. And this applies to a whole areas of science. And when we look at the theory of evolution, the same thing applies. And this was one of the things that they point out. So the theory of evolution requires mutations to produce new genetic code, right? So we start with some, primordial organism that slowly evolved over time. It mutated, and the reproductive, as it divided and reproduced itself, it mutated over time, and somehow, it formed into the different types of bacteria and yeasts, and then into, little worms, and then into plants and so forth, and all the different animals. And we know that the way, reproduction works, it involves the DNA code and has all these letters and this sort of thing. Now, today we can do measurements, and we can actually measure the rate at which the code alters from one generation to the next. Because remember, recently I've talked about, when we have this cell division occurring, and this can occur in the reproductive cells as well, in the gamete cells, when we have this reproduction of the gamete cells and the DNA is in them, there can be copying errors. But generally there's this whole mechanism to prevent copying errors from happening and check before the the code is confirmed in the dividing cell. And so what they've done is they've done measurements now, and there's roughly about 100 code letters different in each generation. So this is the small amount of mutations that are carried on. Now, when we consider that, the code for, something like an ape and a human, where they say, well, chimpanzees, they claimed that there was only, 1, 2, 3 or 4% difference in the code between humans and chimpanzees. In actual fact, when they did those measurements, they're only looking at bits of the code that they understood. When you take in the whole code, there's vast sections of the chimp code that are very different to the human code. So it's only about 85% the same. And when you think, a lot of the structures are similar, blood biochemistry is similar, all this sort of thing. So no wonder the code's similar. And so it actually is much larger, than they claim. But even if it was only a couple of percent or even 1%, what they're saying is that at the rate that we have mutation, 100 code letters per generation, and the fact that, the code is, 3 billion or so letters in the code, then there's just not enough time in the evolution timescale to produce the mutations to, allow for all these changes to occur. That, you need, so they say that the change from humans to, apes to humans, or some chimpanzee-like creature to humans, occurred over about 1 million years or so. But in actual fact, you'd need, 1 billion years of that sort of time, with the rate of which we measure these mutations occurring to produce enough mutations to make even just a tiny change like that. And when this is applied to the whole theory of evolution, what we find is there's just not enough time for evolution to have occurred and produced all these different mutations, because as we know, the rate at which mutations form are relatively low that get through the checking system. And on top of that, remember, these mutations all have to be ones that end up working. Now, the other thing that was pointed out in the film was that when we look at these mutations, they generally produce disease or nothing. They don't produce any significant new information. And this has been a major, major stumbling block for the theory of evolution. And so when we look at the history, when we look at the science that is trying to put together the history, it all confirms the biblical account. Now, another interesting thing that they pointed out in this film was that when we look at the genetic evidence, and we're getting some really good evidence, and as I said, a couple of people that spoke on this video, they earned their doctorates from, really good universities, one from Harvard, one from Ohio State Uni and so forth, right in this area of molecular genetics. And they also had John Stanford speaking. He's a PhD from Cornell, University of Cornell, again in the area of genetics, a world-leading genetic researcher. And so as we understand a whole lot more about this genetics, one of the things that they talked about was the bottleneck effect. And they talked about how, for example, in Africa now, the population of cheetahs there is decreasing. And that it's getting so low that if I think there's about 1,000 cheetahs left or something like that, if I've remembered the figure right. And what they're saying is that the problem now is that they're inbreeding and they're producing deformities. They're not producing new, better cheetahs. They're producing the cheetahs with disease and deformities. And what they're saying is they're very close to possibly a bottleneck situation where the cheetahs could become extinct. Now, one of the fascinating things is, as they pointed out, that genetically the Y chromosome in males seems to have originated from one single male, and the same with the X chromosome too, from one particular female in the past. And of course, that would have been we know the Adam and Eve story. So again, this is fitting this. But one of the other things is that they were pointing out that if you have particular bottlenecks where you have small levels of population, they reproduce between themselves. They reinforce particular traits and you lose other traits. Now, it's very interesting that the Bible talks about after the flood, there was the Tower of Babel, and the people who built the Tower of Babel. As a matter of fact, we were talking about this with this young man friend of mine. I've known him for a long time growing up, and he's very close to our family. And he was saying it's very interesting reading about the Tower of Babel account and how around the world people, Central America and Egypt and all these sort of places have built these towers and these, pyramid-type buildings. Matter of fact, I think on my computer just this week, one of the Mayan temples has come up as a background from Microsoft. But pointed this out. But one of the interesting things that came out in this discussion in this film was that at the Tower of Babel, it talked about how God confused the language. Everybody spoke one language, but God confused them, and they broke up into different groups because God scrambled their language, and they found that certain groups could understand one another and others couldn't, and so they moved away in all different directions. So you then start with a small population group that then interbreed between themselves in that population group, and they preserve then those characteristics. And how this exactly fits the different race characteristics that we have in the world today. And so there were some fascinating things that came out of this, that when we look again at the mutation rate, there's no way that the diversity of species on the rate at which mutations occur could have evolved in that time. Even if the Earth was formed at the beginning of when they claim the universe was, Big Bang happened, 14 billion years ago or thereabouts. There just is not enough time, let alone all the other issues that I've talked about in the past of, how a meaningful code could form that matched the actual physical structure it was in and the code reader and all this sort of thing. So what the basis of this is, the bottom line is this, that when we look at the science that we can measure today and do the readings and the measurements today, it fits the biblical account. It fits the biblical timeline. Matter of fact, when we look at the biblical timeline and the population of the earth, it fits an age of about 6,000 years, not 100,000 to 200,000 years of sort of human type existence on the earth. And the other thing is, if we had humans around that long, and we know, for example, the Neanderthals, they buried people and preserved graves and this sort of thing. Were all the graves of all the people that should have lived? They're not there. What we observe fits the biblical account. And I think this is why we can have so much confidence. And the other thing is, this is very important for young people today, because the Bible tells us that God is coming back. God is coming back. He's going to put an end to evil. The surface of this world's going to be destroyed. There's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. And those people who believe in God are going to be resurrected, or those who are alive, translated, to be with God. They'll see God do all this, make all the earth made new, and that is where we will live together with God. And there'll be no more death there, no more separation from loved ones. And this is a beautiful hope. Evolution gives no hope to young people, no hope at all. And if, you happen to be born into, a very well-to-do, well-off family, like this young man is, that's good. But even many of the young people that are born into these well-to-do families too, where the family's well-off, they're turning to drugs too, because what's the future? What is there to live for? And the Bible gives us this hope that there is a wonderful God. And, of course, this is the message that so much needs to get out to the young people. Evolution theory is wrong. We were created by God who loves us. We are special to him. And there's a future planned for us. And young people need to know that message and know that they can go to that God. And they'll find out about that God by reading the Bible like this young man is doing. Remember, if you'd like to re-listen to this program, you can Google 3ABN Australia, or one word, .org.au, and click on the listen button. I'm Dr. John Ashton. You've been listening to Faith and Science. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.